There is a category of confrontation in which both sides understand precisely what the other side is capable of, precisely what it would cost to find out, and precisely why neither of them wants to find out. In that understanding lives the most dangerous kind of standoff. Not the kind that is stable because both sides are restrained, but the kind that is stable only as long as every decision is made correctly, by every person with authority to make it, for as long as the confrontation lasts. One miscalculation, one misread signal, one moment of ambiguity resolved in the wrong direction. The Persian Gulf does not forgive those moments. At 8:44 a.m., the USS Arleigh Burke-class destroyer was in transit through the central Persian Gulf on a northbound heading at 16 knots, 27 nautical miles south of Farsi Island, conducting a transit that had been planned, filed, and executed within the internationally recognized shipping lanes of the Gulf's central channel. The transit was not a provocation. It was a presence operation, the specific, deliberate expression of the American position that the Persian Gulf was international water and that American naval vessels would operate in it in exactly the manner that international maritime law allowed. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had its own position on that question, which it had been expressing through a sustained pattern of maritime harassment operations for the better part of 11 years, and which it was about to express again through a method that was newer, more precisely calibrated, and significantly more difficult to respond to than the fast boat swarms that had characterized its earlier operational repertoire. At 8:47 a.m., 3 minutes into the destroyer's transit of the Central Channel sector, the surface search radar registered 5 contacts emerging from the northern bearing at high speed. The contacts were at 14 nautical miles, speed 38 knots, heading 192. 192 was directly south. The destroyer was heading north. The convergence geometry was head-on. 5 fast boats. 38 knots. 14 miles. At combined closure speed of 54 knots, the 5 boats would reach the destroyer's position in approximately 15 minutes. The tactical action officer reported the contacts at 8:47 a.m. and 12 seconds and simultaneously broadcast on Channel 16. Directing the approaching contacts to identify themselves, state their intentions, and alter course to maintain safe separation. The transmission was made in English and Farsi. No response. The commanding officer was on the bridge. He had been watching the northern bearing since the transit began, not because the intelligence advisory had specifically flagged this sector at this time, but because 15 years of operating in this waterway had produced in him the specific professional attention that distinguished experienced Gulf operators from those who had not yet learned what the Gulf's quiet mornings sometimes preceded. He acknowledged the TAO's report and kept his eyes on the horizon to the north, where nothing was visible yet and where the radar said 5 contacts were coming at 38 knots. The 5 contacts slowed at 8:51 a.m. From 38 knots to approximately 22 knots, over a 30-second deceleration period that took the formation from a closure geometry that would have brought it to the destroyer in 11 minutes to a geometry that would bring it to the destroyer in approximately 23 minutes at the new speed. The deceleration was not a withdrawal. It was a positioning adjustment, the kind executed by a formation that had assessed the tactical picture, identified the optimal engagement geometry, and was now moving to occupy it rather than forcing a high-speed confrontation that did not serve its operational objective. The commanding officer noted the deceleration and the timing. 3 minutes and 47 seconds from the contact's initial appearance to their speed reduction. Enough time for whoever was commanding the Iranian formation to assess the destroyer's position, evaluate the geometry, communicate with their command authority, receive guidance, and execute. 4 minutes for a complete decision cycle from detection to tactical adjustment. A response time consistent with a formation that had been briefed on this transit and had a pre-planned response ready for execution. They had known the destroyer was coming. The transit route was filed. Someone had that filing. At 8:53 a.m., the 5 contacts split. 4 held their current heading at 22 knots while the 5th accelerated to approximately 35 knots on a diverging course that took it southwest, away from the destroyer, perpendicular to the transit lane, toward the western side of the channel. The split was executed cleanly and simultaneously, as though both elements had received the same signal at the same moment. A split into 2 elements. 4 contacts on the approach bearing, 1 contact moving to a flanking position. The flanking contact's heading, if maintained, would bring it to a position on the destroyer's port side in approximately 18 minutes, at which point the destroyer would have 4 contacts to its north on the direct approach bearing and 1 contact to its west on the flanking bearing. A 3-dimensional blocking geometry. Not a high-speed attack formation. A deliberate, methodical positioning of 5 boats into a configuration that would, when complete, place armed vessels on 2 separate bearings around the destroyer's transit course. The commanding officer made 3 decisions at 8:53 a.m. He directed the MH-60R helicopter on deck to launch and take up an observation orbit above the contact formation. He directed the Combat Direction Center to activate the cooperative engagement capability and begin transmitting track data on all 5 contacts to every vessel in the sector. And he directed a second Channel 16 broadcast, more specific than the first, directed at the contacts' observed positions, restating the destroyer's lawful transit posture and directing the contacts to clear the shipping lane immediately. No response. The MH-60R launched at 8:55 a.m. and had visual contact on the formation's primary element at 8:57 a.m. The helicopter pilot reported what he saw in the factual language of someone confirming a thermal picture he had already seen on the radar display. 4 Hendijan-class fast attack craft in loose formation, armed with gun mounts forward and what appeared to be anti-ship missile canisters amidships. Standard IRGCN fast attack configuration. The 5th boat, which the flanking element had separated from, was a larger platform, a Thondor-class patrol boat, displacing roughly 4 times the mass of the Hendijans, armed with a 76mm main gun and a C-802 anti-ship missile battery. A Thondor-class with C-802 missiles was not a harassment platform. It was a weapons system capable of engaging a surface combatant at up to 120 kilometers. The Thondor was positioning to the destroyer's western flank with its C-802 battery in an orientation that, when its movement was complete, would place the destroyer within engagement range from a bearing that the destroyer's own systems were designed to counter, but that created a geometric engagement problem when combined with the 4 Hendijans approaching from the north. The commanding officer had been tracking the Thondor's C-802 configuration since the MH-60R's visual report arrived. He was also tracking the time. The Thondor would reach its flanking position in approximately 14 minutes at its current speed. The 4 Hendijans would reach the destroyer's bow sector, the zone where their combined positioning would create a physical obstruction to continued transit on the current heading, in approximately 17 minutes. 3 minutes after the Thondor was in position, the Hendijans would close the forward geometry. The sequence was deliberate. The Thondor first, then the Hendijans. The Thondor in position before the Hendijans closed the forward sector because the Thondor's C-802 battery was the deterrent that was supposed to make the destroyer's response to the Hendijans' forward blocking maneuver less certain. The commanding officer transmitted a flash report to 5th Fleet at 8:58 a.m. The report characterized the formation's composition, the Thondor's weapons configuration, the developing blocking geometry, and the commanding officer's assessment of the sequence's intent. He did not request engagement authorization. He reported the situation and requested guidance on the rules of engagement application to a blocking maneuver by armed vessels that had not yet committed any act that was unambiguously hostile under the applicable legal framework. Rules of engagement. The legal architecture that governed what the commanding officer could do and when he could do it constructed in offices far from the Persian Gulf by lawyers and policy officials who had been trying to build a framework that preserved American operational freedom while minimizing the risk of incidents that neither government wanted. The framework was good. It was also designed around scenarios that had been previously encountered, and the specific combination of a Thondor with C-802 missiles positioning on the flanking bearing while 4 Hendijans advanced on the forward bearing was a scenario whose closest analog in the existing framework was a contested passage. A situation the framework addressed with specific, carefully worded guidance about what constituted a threat sufficient to authorize a defensive response. The threshold had not been crossed. The Thondor had not activated its fire control radar. The Hendijans had not fired. The formation was armed, maneuvering and blocking, but it had not yet done any specific thing that the rules of engagement characterized as an act authorizing the use of force. 5th Fleet's guidance arrived at 9:02 a.m. 4 minutes of staffing. The guidance was clear and operationally specific. The destroyer was to maintain its lawful transit, continue broadcasting its position and intentions on Channel 16, and document all Iranian vessel actions and communications for the diplomatic and legal record. The destroyer was authorized to take evasive action if the Iranian vessels created an imminent collision hazard. It was not authorized to use weapons unless an Iranian vessel committed a specific hostile act as defined in the rules of engagement. Maintain transit. Document. No weapons until a specific hostile act. The commanding officer acknowledged and continued north. At 9:03 a.m., the 4 Hendijans accelerated. From 22 knots to approximately 34 knots on the same bearing, the formation tightening its spread slightly as it accelerated, reducing the lateral gaps between boats in a way that reduced the passable corridor for a large ship attempting to maintain its northbound course. A destroyer at 16 knots navigating through a formation of 4 fast boats at 34 knots had a geometry problem that was partly nautical and partly tactical. The destroyer could not maneuver significantly without making course changes that would take it off its filed transit route and potentially toward the Thondor's position to the west. The commanding officer altered course 3 degrees east at 9:03 a.m. and 12 seconds. The adjustment was within the transit lane's boundaries and moved the destroyer's track slightly away from the center of the Hendijans' approach corridor. It was a minimal maneuver, the smallest course change that produced any geometric benefit while staying within the transit lane's defined boundaries. It was also a visible signal. The destroyer was not stopping, not reversing course, and not engaging the Iranian formation. It was adjusting within the rules it was operating under and continuing north. At 9:04 a.m., the Thondor activated its surface search radar in active mode. Not its fire control radar, not the specific emission that would constitute a targeting lock and the rules of engagement's hostile act threshold. Its surface search radar, the emission that every warship used for navigation and situational awareness, which was not a hostile act, which was not a threatening act, which was simply a ship turning on a system it used routinely. A surface search radar on a Thondor-class patrol boat with a C-802 battery positioned on the destroyer's flanking bearing was also an emitter that the destroyer's own systems would track and characterize, and whose beam angle relative to the destroyer's position would tell the electronic warfare officer something specific about whether the Thondor was painting the destroyer as a navigation contact or building a targeting picture with its surface search system in preparation for transitioning to fire control mode. The EW officer reported to the commanding officer at 9:04 a.m. and 17 seconds. The Thondor's surface search radar beam was oriented toward the destroyer. Not sweeping, oriented, held on a single bearing. The destroyer's position. The distinction between a surface search radar sweeping its standard arc and a surface search radar held on a single bearing was not, in any legal document governing this confrontation, the threshold for a hostile act. It was, in the operational sense of every person in the Combat Direction Center who had spent years learning to read Iranian naval behavior in this waterway, the step before the threshold. The commanding officer directed the Mark 38 chain gun mounts to train toward the Thondor bearing at 9:05 a.m. Not fire. Train. Elevate the mount's apparent readiness posture in a way that was visible to the MH-60R overhead, which was transmitting its sensor picture on the tactical net and potentially visible to the Thondor's crew through their own optical systems. A destroyer that had visibly trained its weapons on the bearing of a patrol boat that was holding a surface search radar beam on it was communicating something specific through the language of naval posture, in the vocabulary that both sides understood, without crossing the threshold that the rules of engagement required crossing before the next verb in the sequence. At 9:05 a.m. and 44 seconds, the Thondor shifted its radar from held bearing mode to standard sweep. The beam was no longer oriented on the destroyer. It was moving. The commanding officer noted the change and kept the Mark 38 mounts trained. At 9:06 a.m., the four Hendijans decelerated again. From 34 knots to 18 knots over a 40-second interval, the formation slowing in a way that reduced the geometric pressure on the destroyer's forward corridor. Still on approach bearing. Still between the destroyer and the open water to the north. But slower. The specific slowdown that happened when a formation had received a signal that caused it to recalculate its next move. The signal had been the Mark 38 mounts. The confrontation held at that state for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. The destroyer continuing north at 16 knots. The four Hendijans moving at 18 knots on the approach bearing, neither closing further nor withdrawing. The Thondor running standard sweep radar on its flanking position to the west. The MH-60R maintaining its observation orbit. The Channel 16 frequency running the destroyer's repeated position broadcasts into silence that the Iranian formation continued to not respond to. 8 minutes and 40 seconds of a confrontation that was exactly balanced between the threshold of a hostile act and the threshold of a capitulation. Neither side crossing either line, both sides aware that the line existed. Both sides calculating in the specific margin between those two thresholds where the next move lived. At 9:14 a.m. and 49 seconds, the lead Hendijan altered course. It turned west. Not dramatically, a gradual, committed turn onto a westerly heading that took it out of the destroyer's forward approach sector and onto a parallel track 3 nautical miles to the west. The second Hendijan followed within 8 seconds. The third followed the second. The fourth followed the third. The formation executed a sequential turn that was practiced, deliberate, and accomplished with the specific precision of a maneuver that had been briefed and rehearsed before the formation entered the water. They were not withdrawing. The Hendijans' westerly heading placed them in a trailing position relative to the destroyer's continued northbound transit, behind and to the west, maintaining contact at distance rather than clearing the sector entirely. The blocking geometry was resolved. The escort posture was maintained. The Thondor maintained its position to the west for 4 additional minutes, then turned onto a northbound heading that paralleled the destroyer's course at approximately 8 nautical miles lateral offset. Following. Still in the picture. No longer in the blocking geometry. The destroyer cleared the sector at 9:31 a.m., when its northbound transit carried it beyond the geometric relationship with the Iranian formation that had defined the engagement area. The Iranian vessels did not follow beyond that point. The Hendijans altered course northeast at 9:33 a.m., toward Farsi Island, toward their standard patrol area, at a speed that was neither hurried nor loitering. The Thondor altered course northeast at 9:35 a.m. They were going home. The engagement debrief began at Bahrain at 1 p.m. The documentation had been comprehensive throughout. Every contact track, every radar emission, every course and speed change logged with the precision that the diplomatic and legal record required and that the operational community needed for the analysis that followed. The first finding of the debrief was the pre-positioning intelligence. The formation had emerged from the northern bearing with a composed, pre-planned response to the destroyer's exact transit position and speed. A response that required knowledge of the transit's timing. The transit route had been filed. The inference was straightforward. The second finding was the Thondor's role. A Thondor-class with C-802 missiles in the flanking position was not a harassment platform. It was a deterrent, a weapon capable of holding the destroyer at risk that was positioned to complicate the destroyer's defensive calculus and to occupy a portion of its crew's attention and planning during the Hendijans' forward maneuvering. The formation had been specifically structured to present simultaneous threats on two bearings, one of which was within the effective range of a system that could reach the destroyer at distances far greater than the Hendijans needed to close to. The third finding was the Mark 38 response. The Thondor's transition from held-bearing radar mode to standard sweep, occurring 44 seconds after the Mark 38 mounts trained on its bearing, was assessed as a direct response to the destroyer's weapons orientation. The sequence, destroyer trains weapons, Thondor shifts radar posture, Hendijans decelerate, was consistent with a formation that was specifically calibrated to operate at the edge of the rules of engagement threshold, and that had been assessing the destroyer's posture in real time to determine how close to that threshold it could operate without triggering the specific defensive response that crossing it would authorize. The formation had read the destroyer's posture. The Mark 38 training had communicated something in the vocabulary of naval presence that the Iranian formation commander had understood and had responded to by stepping back from the held-bearing radar mode that was the step before the threshold. One visual signal from a weapons system that had not fired. One step back from the threshold. 8 minutes and 40 seconds of balanced confrontation. And then a course change by a formation that had decided its objective was not going to be achieved today. What the objective had been was not formally resolved in the debrief. The blocking geometry, if completed, would have placed a destroyer in the position of either altering its lawful transit to avoid an armed formation in the shipping lane, or attempting to transit through the formation at a speed and course that created a collision hazard that the rules of engagement's evasive action provision would have required addressing. An addressing that, depending on how the Iranian formation responded to the evasive action, carried the potential for outcomes that neither government wanted, or both governments. The debrief documented both interpretations and did not resolve which was correct. What the debrief documented without ambiguity was the outcome. The transit was completed. The shipping lane was maintained. The legal posture was preserved. The diplomatic record was clean, comprehensive, and immediately available for the engagement between government lawyers and policy officials that would follow. 0 weapons fired. 0 hostile acts committed in the legal sense. 0 airspace yielded. 0 water yielded. 0 filing altered. The Persian Gulf was the same Persian Gulf it had been before 8:44 a.m. The destroyer was north of where it had started. The Iranian formation was northeast of where it had been. The line in the Gulf is not visible. It is not charted. It exists in the accumulated decisions of every engagement like this one. Every standoff that held because the people on the bridge and in the combat direction center and in the rapid decision chain above them made the right calls in the right sequence in the right time and communicated through the specific vocabulary of armed presence what words on the radio would not say and weapons would say too loudly. The Mark 38 said it. The Thondor heard it. The Hendijans turned. That is how the line holds on a morning when no one fires. That is, some days, the most difficult version of holding it.